Up to this point in the course, we always worked locally. Our applications always ran in the browser of the user using them, so in this case, us, since we're the only one who tested them thus far. But in reality, of course, you often need to persist some data on a backend, on a server side. Because at the moment, we also already saw that we have the problem that if the page is reloaded, all the data that was generated by our Vue app is lost. We are going to have a closer look at that in this module, because this module is about connecting our Vue app to a backend. It's about sending HTTP requests with Vue. For that, I'll first of all clarify what exactly a backend is and why we need it. I will of course also show you how you can set up a dummy backend. And then we're going to dive into how to send HTTP requests from inside our Vue app to that backend. With that, let's dive right in. Attached, you find another starting application. Download it, extract it, run npm install followed by npm run serve, and this brings up another Vue app which I prepared for you. It's a basic Vue app, this one, where you can fill out this basic survey, provide your opinion on this learning experience, and then your data will be saved and output down there. This application uses features we already learned about. We have two main components in the app.vue file, the survey component and the component which outputs the submitted results in the end. I'm managing my list of submitted survey results here in app.vue. Here I got a method for adding a new result. And the learning survey itself, this component, holds this form with an input element which is bound with vModel and with a bunch of radio buttons which are also bound with vModel. And then this form is managed just as you learned it in the forms module. Got a submit method. I'm validating the input, showing an error message. Here, if one or more of the input fields are invalid. A custom event is emitted, the survey submit event, which holds the entered username and rating. And that survey submit event is then caught in app.vue here on the learning survey component. And that then triggers the store survey method where this survey data is enriched with an ID and then stored in this array. And then we have the user experiences component. That's this component here, which simply outputs all submitted survey results with v4. I got another component in here, this survey result component, which is just responsible for outputting the individual list items. Got some conditional styles in there, some conditional CSS classes, and overall this is nothing too fancy. Now of course this application has one problem. If I submit a bunch of data here, we see all that data here, but whenever we reload the page, all the data is lost. And this is not a bug, this is, well, the only way it can behave, because thus far we always stored all the data just in Vue and therefore just in the computer memory. That is what happened here. So all the data we create with all those components is just stored locally in memory and therefore lost whenever this website is reloaded. Therefore the Vue app is dumped and a new instance of the Vue app starts up, and therefore all the data attached to the previously running Vue app is lost. This is just how browsers work. There's nothing you can do about that. But of course, in reality, you are often building applications where data should be saved, and where it maybe should not just be saved locally on the computer of your user, for example in a file or anything like that, but instead where it should be stored on a server which you as the developer own. Think of Amazon.com. All the products which are listed there, they are of course stored on Amazon's servers and shown to the users that visit Amazon. So it is quite common that you need a server that holds data, and then the Vue applications running on the computers of your users, running in the browsers of your users, those Vue applications should connect to your servers and fetch data from there, or send data to them. So here, this survey application, for example, should probably not just output survey results down there, but instead the data should also be submitted to your server where it's saved. In reality, this here might even be two separate Vue applications, where the survey form is the application you show to your users, and this dashboard here, where you see the submitted surveys, that might be a Vue application only you can visit. But here it's merged into one so that we can see both in action. Nonetheless, we typically want a server to which we can send our data. And that's exactly what a backend is. It's the other end. It's the part that does not run in the browser of your users, like your Vue app does, but instead it's about code running on a server you as a developer own. It's about a database you as a developer might own. And that database would also be on that server which you own. So it's detached from the Vue app. Nonetheless, we want to communicate, and that's what this module is about. So obviously, we need a backend. Now, creating a backend, that is something you could take an entire course on, because for writing server-side code, for writing code that runs on a server, and for connecting a database to that code, there are dedicated programming languages like Node.js or PHP. And you can, for example, take my Node.js course if you want to learn all about that. This course focuses on Vue, and therefore I want to keep that focus. So we're not going to write our own server-side code here. Instead, we're going to use Firebase, which is a service that gives us a backend where we don't have to write any code to get started with storing data. I will emphasize, though, that this is not just a database which we're using, it's a complete backend service. It is like if you had your own server with your own logic on it, just in this case already pre-written and pre-configured for you. The good thing about Firebase, which is a service offered by Google, is that you can get started for free with it. You can start for free, and what we're going to do here is possible for free. And that's why I'm using this service. All you need for this service is a Google account. So make sure you create one and then log in here into that console, into the Firebase console. Once you are logged in and in this Firebase console, you can add a new project and give it any name of your choice. I'll name it Vue HTTP Demo, but this name is up to you. Click Continue. You can disable this, you don't need that here, the analytics, and then create this project. Now, Firebase is a service that has way more to offer than what we are going to use. Nonetheless, it has all we need here to have a dummy backend, and that's why we are going to be using it. We're also going to use this Firebase service in a way that is typical for communicating with a backend, so that what you learn here will also apply to any other backend you might be using. That's another reason why I chose Firebase. So now we're in the Firebase console, and here we want to go to Database, because we're going to use the database part of the Firebase service. It's just one of the offerings they have, but here we need a database. And we're not going to use the Cloud Firestore here, but instead this real-time database. It's a bit easier to use, and it has a nice REST API, which is a specific interface we can use for sending our HTTP requests to it. It's very easy to use and therefore a great choice here. So let's create such a real-time database and make sure you start in test mode. Click Enable. And here we go. Now, you should see something like this on the screen, and for the moment, that is all we need. Now let's leave it at that, and let's go back to our Vue app. And here we are now going to see how we can send HTTP requests to this Firebase backend, and how we're not going to do it. So with Firebase set up, how do we communicate with it, or with any backend, from inside our Vue app? We actually, accidentally, already saw a way of sending HTTP requests earlier. In our form, the learning survey component, here in the form, there we have a submit button. And I mentioned earlier in the course that we want to prevent the browser default when that form is being submitted, because if we don't do this, a HTTP request would be sent. If I remove the prevent modifier here temporarily, reload, and click submit, watch this reload icon here. You see, it briefly turned into a cross. Every time I click this, what happens is that the browser uses its default behavior, which is to send a HTTP request. The problem just is, it's not sending that request to our backend, to our Firebase service, but instead it sends the request to the same address that was used for serving this page. And with Vue applications, that is typically not the page that should handle this request. In this case, it's our local computer, and our local computer does not have any code expecting this request. So therefore, this default request goes into the void. Now, you could be building applications where you also use Vue, where your Vue app is served by the same server that should be handling the request. In that case, this browser default might be fine. But in the vast majority of cases, you'll have a separate server for your Vue app, which is just delivering this Vue app to your users, than you have for handling all the user data. And that's exactly the scenario where you don't want this browser default, but where instead you want to prevent it and handle the submitted data in JavaScript with Vue. For example, also to validate it and show such a client-side error message. So show this error paragraph, for example. That is something you might want to do. And once you validate it, you then want to take the data and send it to the server of your choice, not necessarily to the same server that is serving this application. And that's exactly what we want to do here. So how do we send a request to Firebase then, which is our chosen backend in this case? Well, the nice thing about this Firebase service, and there the real-time database, is that it has this HTTP address, which you see here. And if you send a request of a specific format to this address, the data will automatically be picked up by Firebase and will be written to a database. Now, it might look like we're directly talking to a database with that, but we actually aren't. This is a HTTP address that leads to some server-side code, which we can't see, which was written by the Firebase team, which parses the request that will be sent by us, and then extracts data and then writes it to a database. So for us, it will look like we're directly talking to a database, but we actually aren't. But this is the address, or part of the address, to which we want to send a request. And of course, make sure you pick the address you are seeing in your dashboard, not mine. This address will not be available anymore when you're viewing this course. So we want to send a request to that. But how do we now send a request from inside our Vue code here? Well, there are a couple of options. We can use third-party packages like Axios, which is a very popular JavaScript package for sending HTTP requests from inside JavaScript. It's very powerful and very easy to use, and definitely worth a look. Alternatively, browsers also have built-in methods for sending HTTP requests. Precisely, there is the fetch method, which sounds like it's only there to fetch data, but it's actually a function that allows us to send data to servers as well. Fetch takes a URL as a first argument, and then we can configure it to get data from that URL or to send data to that URL. And I'm going to work with fetch here since it's built into the browser, but you could absolutely also look into packages like Axios. Both Axios and Fetch will send so-called behind-the-scenes HTTP requests. That means that we won't reload the page, our application will not be killed and restarted. Instead, the Vue application will continue running and the HTTP request is just sent, well, behind the scenes to our backend. And that's exactly the behavior we want here. We want to ensure that our request is sent without restarting the application. So how does fetch work then? As I mentioned, we want to provide a first argument, which is the URL to which this request should be sent. Now that's the URL I got from Firebase, but actually we need to tweak it a little bit. You can add, after the slash here, any identifier of your choice. I'll name it surveys. And then, important, add .json after that. This is not something Vue needs or backends in general need. This .json at the end is just a Firebase specific requirement. When you're working with a different backend, there is a high chance that you don't need it. But for Firebase, we need to add it. And this key here, surveys, that's up to you. Firebase will then automatically create a node in this database and store our data under that node. So that is the first part. Here we got this fetch function. Now, by default, this will try to get data from here. Now here, I don't want to get data, instead I want to send data. So we can pass a second argument to fetch, and that is a JavaScript object where we can configure this request. And here we have a method property which we can set. By default, the value is a string, get, but we can set it to post. And this influences which kind of HTTP request we send. There are get and post requests. Get for getting data, post for posting, so for sending data. And there also are other verbs like delete or patch for deleting and updating. But here we need post to send a new piece of data. And we also need to add some headers, some metadata to this outgoing request. To be precise, we should set the content type header to application/JSON, telling the server that we'll add some data to this request, which will be in the JSON format, which is basically just text, but text formatted in a specific way, which is very easy for machines to parse and read. And that's the next thing we gotta add. We gotta add a body to this request, which is the data we wanna add. And here, of course, that should be my survey results here, the name and the rating. So here I'll add a new JavaScript object as a body, where I set the name to this username and the rating to this rating. Chosen rating. So the values which I emitted in the past are now added to this object. And therefore, of course, here it should be entered name. So the values which I submitted before, entered name and chosen rating, these are the values which are now encoded in this object. But that's a JavaScript object. As I just said, we want to send JSON data, and JavaScript has a convenience method we can use for that. There is a JSON object on which you can call the stringify method, to which you can pass your object. And this turns this JavaScript object into this JSON format, into a string that has this format we want to send. And now that will send a HTTP request to Firebase. This also means that we no longer need to emit our custom event here, and hence I will comment out everything that is related to that. And of course it will also mean that we no longer manage our data here in app.vue. Now we could do that. You could have an application where you want to send a request and still also manage your data locally. That could be a scenario you have. Here, it's just not the scenario I have. So I will comment out the data in AppView, and I will comment out this methods block here with the store survey method, because we'll no longer be doing this locally in our Vue app, at least for this app. We're not going to do it locally anymore, and hence we don't need that data and the methods here anymore. And that also means that we no longer will bind survey submit here on the learning survey, and we will no longer provide results to user experiences. And that of course means that inside of user experiences, for the moment, we'll no longer get a value for results. We'll take care about that later. Back to our learning survey. There we are now sending this HTTP request. Let's see whether that works. Let's save everything, reload this application, and let's submit our survey result here. Now, did it work? let's have a look at Firebase. It should have worked, and here you should see a surveys node where you see this random text, which is definitely different for you, and in there you should see your data. Now this random text is just a unique ID that was automatically generated by Firebase. And that's great, we can later use that ID on the front end. But now here we got our data stored on Firebase. So that's great. How can we now get that data back to the front end when we click this Load Submitted Experience button, which at the moment is not doing anything? We now want to get the data that is stored on this server. And for that, I want to connect this Load Submitted Experiences button. So in the User Experiences component, we previously received results as a prop. That will no longer be the case, so we can remove that. Instead now, I want to manage some data in here and have my results as a data key. And initially it's an empty array. Now I also want to add some methods here though, or one method to be precise, a method that should be triggered when this button is clicked. So here I want to add a click listener to the space button and trigger the load experiences method. Now that's a method we need to add now, so make sure you add it under that same name to methods. And in here, we now want to send another HTTP request to the server we previously sent our data to, but now to get data. For that, we can of course copy this request from learning-survey.view and bring it over to this new load experiences method. Now here, I want to send a request to this same address which I used for storing the data, but now it should be a get request instead of a post request, because we want to get data. The good thing is that would be the default, so we don't even need to set this. Now since we're getting data, we'll also not have any body, so we can remove that as well, because a GET request does not carry any data. And now here for the headers, since there is no body, we also don't need the headers. So we have an empty config object, and therefore we are also allowed to delete it. This will now send a request to get the data. But we'll face a problem with that. When we send this request, how do we get access to the data that will eventually be loaded? Well, fetch returns a so-called promise. Now what's a promise and why do we need that? Well, as I just said, the data will be loaded eventually. As you can imagine, if you're sending an HTTP request, that can take a couple of milliseconds or seconds. Firebase is super fast and my local internet is pretty fast, so it should be pretty quick. But still, it might take 100, 200, 500 milliseconds for the data to arrive. And JavaScript is a language that will not pause and wait with the other code execution until that result is there. That is good because it would mean, if it would pause, that our web apps would freeze all the time waiting for some behind-the-scenes HTTP request to finish. So that's the idea behind promises. Fetch returns an object on which we can listen for the data once it is there, to then set up code that will be executed when that data is there. And we set up such a listener by adding a then method here on the result of fetch. The then method takes a function which will be executed once the result is there. It will be executed automatically by the browser once the data is there. And in here, we'll also get an argument automatically, and that will be the response of this request. So the response sent back by the server to the browser. Now here we can then work with that response and try to parse it. We can, for example, check if the response is OK. This response object, which we get automatically by the browser, has an OK property that indicates whether it was a successful request or not. So for example, if the server sends back a 404 code, this would not be OK. If it is OK, however, we can continue with the response and try to read the data that's in there. For that, the response has various methods. For example, it has a JSON method which we can call, which will parse the data that's part of the response if it's in JSON format. And JSON is the de facto standard for exchanging data, and therefore not only do we send data in JSON format when we send the request, Firebase also replies with JSON data when we get data from it. So the JSON method is the method we want to use for parsing the data that's part of the response. Now this also turns out to yield a promise, and therefore what we can do here inside of such a then block here is we can return this response JSON call here. So we can return the promise yielded by that, and we can add another then method after the first then method. And this then method will be triggered when this return promise is done. So here we have another function, but here we'll get the actual data which response JSON yielded. And that's now the place where we have access to the data, and therefore here for the moment I will just log it. We'll take care about error handling later. For the moment, let's just see if we can get that data. So let's save everything, open up the developer tools, reload, and click load submitted experiences. And after half a second or a second, you should see some data here. And that indeed is the data that was stored on the server. It has this Firebase ID, and then stored under that ID, we have a nested object with a name and a rating. So fetching that data works. Now, of course, we don't just want to fetch it and log it to the console, but we want to output it on the screen. Now, to do that, all we got to do here is we have to add it to the results we have here, or set results to a new array which is full of that data. Now, setting this results equal to data will not do the trick, because data is not an array. It's a JavaScript object with this ID as a property name, and then in there we have another nested object with name and rating. I actually want to work with an array instead, and therefore we need to transform the data. I'll add a results array here, an empty one, and then I will go through all the IDs in data. Keep in mind that data is an object full of such ID properties. So now I'm going through all those IDs here, and I will push a new object to my results array here, to this temporary results array for every ID property I find in data. And there I'll set an ID key to this ID, which I'm getting here, so to the property names used in data, and set a name equal to data for that ID. So this data object, and there accessing this dynamic ID property. And then there we have a name and a rating field. So here dot name, and set rating equal to data ID rating. That is how I'm generating a bunch of objects with an ID, name, and rating field based on the data we're fetching from Firebase, and I'm adding that all to my temporary results array. And once we're done with this for loop here, I will set this results, so the results data property we're managing here, I'll set this results equal to my temporary results. And that should be all the code we need to transform the incoming data and load it onto our screen. So if we now reload and load the submitted experiences, I get an error. Cannot set property results of undefined. I'm getting this because the this keyword in here actually turns out to not refer to my view instance object, unfortunately. The easiest way of working around that is that we don't use this function syntax here, but this arrow function syntax instead. Arrow functions are another way of writing functions in JavaScript. They work like regular functions, but they have one key difference, that this keyword inside of them does refer to the same context as it does outside of them. And therefore now this will refer to the view instance object. So with that, if I set this and reload and load the submitted experiences, eventually we see the experience here. And if I now would add more data, more experiences, and I load those, we see all those experiences show up here. And that, of course, is a great step forward. Now we're able to save data on a server, and we can also fetch it from there. Now there are a couple of improvements and additions we can make. Sending and getting data works, and that was the main objective of this course. But there is more we can add. For example, when we reload this page, we can of course always load all submitted experiences. And that's the great thing, by the way. Now, when we reload the page, the data isn't lost, because it is stored on this backend server. But when we reload, we might also want to fetch all submitted experiences automatically, without having to press this button first. And that's something that's very easy to implement in Vue.js. In the user experiences component, we have our code for fetching our data. We have the load experiences method. Well, of course, we can also trigger this method, not just when this button is clicked, but when this entire component is loaded for the first time. And how could we do that? Well, you might remember this Vue lifecycle, which every instance and therefore also every component has. We can utilize that. Every component follows that lifecycle, and therefore here in user experiences, we can simply add, maybe here towards the bottom, we can simply add the mounted hook, for example. This will be triggered when the Vue app is mounted, and that means when it's fully initialized and ready to get started. And here we could now trigger the load experiences method, ensuring that when this component is becoming visible, that then it will go ahead and load all experiences. And if I do that and reload, you see the experiences show up automatically after a short while without me pressing this button. Now, so that is a useful improvement here, I would say. What else could we improve? At the moment, we assume that everything is going to work, that we're never getting any error here. But of course, in reality, we could be getting an error. So therefore, besides checking this loading state, I also want to check whether we get data. And because we might not get an error and still not get any data, for example, if we got no data here on Firebase, if I delete all of that, then we can send a successful request, but it will get an empty response because there is no data to be loaded. So we want to handle that. And thereafter, I also want to handle real errors where the server times out, we have a server-side error, or anything like that. But let's start with the no data case. We are setting our data here to the results, and in the end, handling the no data case is easy. We'll simply not be able to loop through any data here, and therefore results will stay an empty array. So in this case, we should check not just if we're loading or not, but here, with else if maybe, I want to check if we're not loading, but that we do have data where the length is greater than 0. If length is equal to 0, it's an empty array, and that simply means we have no data. And of course, it's not data, but results. So if results length is greater than 0, we could also add an extra check and check if we have a truthy results value before we try diving into the length. Here, we'll always have results, but in other apps that might not even be set if you fail to load data. Hence, checking this as well could make sense. And then here we could add another paragraph where we say no stored experiences found. Start adding some survey results first. And I want to show this paragraph if, or the else if, we're not loading, but we don't have results, or, and therefore that should go between brackets so that these two statements are evaluated together, or we do have results, but the length is equal to 0. So if we're not loading, but we don't have results, or our results length is equal to 0, then I want to show this no stored experiences found text. Otherwise, I'll check this and show my actual results. And if we save that and reload, we see loading and then our no data message. If I start submitting data though, and I then load the submitted experiences, we see that works. So now we're handling the no data case. But what about real errors? For that, let me show you how a real error could occur here. We can simply manipulate this URL. Of course, that is an error you typically would be able to avoid because you as a developer add that URL. But since I have no influence on the server-side code here, I can't fake a server-side error. Hence, sending a request to an invalid URL is the best thing I can do right now. Let's remove .js at the end. This is something Firebase doesn't like, and if you then send a request to this invalid URL, Firebase will respond with an error message. So let's save that and reload, and everything is red. We see a bunch of red, so clearly this failed. We can handle such errors, which in this case actually is thrown by the browser here. We can handle such errors by adding another block in our then chain. After all those then blocks, we can add a catch method. So .catch on this long chain of thens and thens. Catch also works on promises, and it takes a function, I'll also use an arrow function here, which will be triggered whenever any error occurs related to the previous then blocks. So related to the original request or thrown in a later then block. Here we'll get the error, and here we can handle it. So here, for example, we can console log the error to get started. If I do that and reload, here, that's my console log. Of course, I'm not here to just log it. So instead, I want to show something to the user on the screen. Because typically, your users are not going to open the developer tools. So they just see loading, and they are wondering whether they will eventually see some data or not. So I want to improve this experience and show an actual error message to the user. Either a dialog or, in my case here, simply a message down there. And for that, we can simply manage another data property in the component where we are sending the request. The error property, for example. The name is up to you though. Doesn't have to be error, like for all those properties. Initially, I'll set it to null, because initially we have no error, but down here, we do have an error. So here I'll set this error equal to failed to fetch data, please try again later. Of course, you could also analyze this error object which you're getting and see if you got more details there and show a more specific error message to your users. That really depends on your application, which kind of errors you want to handle, and so on. But this at least is a generic error message that tells the user that something went wrong. So here, I now want to use error to show an error message. For that, I'll add another paragraph here with v-else if in that long block of v-else statements, and check if we're not loading, because of course if we're loading I definitely don't want to show the error message, and if I have an error. And if I do, I simply output the error here, because error is simply set to a string here, so of course we can just output it in our template. And now we can also use v-else here in the end, because we know if we reach that block here, we will have results which we can output, because we're handling all other cases before we handle this case here. Of course, I also want to reset error whenever we send a new request. So when we start sending a new request here, when we set is loading to true, I'll also set error back to null to reset the error at this point. And now with that, my project here complains that this error argument is never getting used. So I will console log it here like this. Alternatively, we simply leave that blank, but I want to show you that you would get this error object that was thrown as an error here. And therefore with that, if I reload, we still see a loading. Let me check why. Oh yeah, because of course here I'm just checking if we're loading, and if we are, I'm always setting loading. Now the problem is we are loading if we get an error, because we only set is loading to false if we're able to read some data, which is not happening here if we catch an error. So of course we should set this is loading to false here in the error case as well, because we are not loading anymore. We weren't successful, but we're not loading anymore, so we need to reset this here as well. But I also noticed another issue, the order here. We're checking if we're loading, but thereafter we're checking if we're not loading, but then if we maybe got no result data. And if that's the case, we'll show our no data message. Actually, I want to switch the order and first check if we have an error, so that this overrides the no data case, and we show the error message instead of the no data message if we have an error. So with all that, let's save that. And now if I reload, we see this failed to fetch data message here. On the other hand, if we do fix this URL here, if I add .json, then you see if I reload, the data gets loaded and displayed correctly again. And if I delete my data here, let's check this case as well. If I now load the data, we see the no data message. And if I add data again and then load it, that works. So now this is also how we can handle errors. Now there's one more thing you gotta know related to that though. The fetch method works such that technical errors, like the one I generated with the invalid URL, are in the end handled with this catch method like that. You also could be errors that are stemming from the server side, so that are stemming from Firebase, which are not technical errors. So where you do get a regular response, but the response simply tells you that something went wrong. And that would by default not be handled with this catch block. And I can show this to you as well. Let me show you a server-side error. And that's something I can do in the learning survey.view file. Here, we're sending the data, and there we are actually not using then or a catch at all. I'm not using then because I don't care about the response here, but I actually should care about whether everything worked or not. So I also want to show the user an error message if sending the data failed. For that, of course, we can add an error property to data here as well. And then simply add a catch method here to wait for a potential error. And if we do get an error, we can set this error equal to something went wrong, try again later, or anything like that. And I want to reset it right before we start fetching. Here I'll set error to null again. So now we also handle errors here in the send data case. And we can use the error property now, for example, here, to show an error message. Of course, you could also instead show an alert, whatever you want to do. But here I'll check if error is truthy, if it is an error string, and in that case, I output the error. And now, of course, I can generate the same error as before if I remove the .json here, now in the case for sending data. If I do that, and I try to send data, I eventually get this error output. Now that's this technical error I was talking about. But now let me show you another kind of error an error which will not be a technical error thrown by the browser, but instead an error generated by the server, which is then still resulting in a regular response being sent back, but a response which is not okay, but which instead has a status code that indicates that something went wrong on the server. And we can force Firebase to do that by removing JSON stringify. With that, we're telling Firebase that we're sending JSON data, and that is what we should send and what Firebase expects. But then we're actually sending a JavaScript object, which is not JSON data. If we do that, reload, and try to submit a new rating, we'll see nothing. Here we see no error message. But if I load my submitted experiences, the new rating, which I just submitted, is not there. I can do this as often as I want, it's not there. And it's also not here in Firebase. There we just have the old rating from before. We can see the problem if I open the developer tools. We got an error here, failed to load request. The server responded with a status of 400. And that's the important part. Now it's not a technical error thrown by the browser, which we had before, but it's a regular response which just has a status code of 400. Success responses always have status codes of 200 or 201. If you have 400-ish or 500-ish responses, that means something went wrong. And that can happen, but the problem is catch is not picking it up. Well, that's just how this fetch method works. We need to add then and have a look at our response. This then function here will always be triggered if we have a regular response, so if we don't have a technical error. And here we can check if the response is okay and then do something. But if it's not okay, which it will not be if we have a 400 or 500 status code, then I want to also set my error. We could do this by setting this error, but we could also do this by throwing a new error object here. Could not save data could be the message which I pass to that. The argument you pass to the error constructor is the message that will be set for the error. And this error constructor here is built into JavaScript. This throws a new error, and this will then automatically reach this catch block. And here I can then actually set this error equal to error.message to use my message here. The message property will be present on this error object because this error constructor creates such an object where what you pass here will be stored on a message property. And if we do that and save this, if I now reload and try doing this again, now we see could not save data here. And now we're showing the user some message that allows the user to, well, at least try again later or anything like that. Now here, of course, the problem is a problem we as a developer should avoid. I should stringify this. But in reality, you could have circumstances where the server generates such an error response without you as the developer, the front end, the Vue developer, being responsible for it. That's why this still was a great example, even though that, of course, in reality would not occur. But it shows you how you can handle such server-side error responses. And with that, we really handle everything. We handle success cases, we can load data, we can show messages if we have no data, and we can also handle errors. So, this is it for this module. You learned how to send HTTP requests, both to send data as well as to get data. You learned how to work with the response data, how to extract it and how to show it. You learned how to show a loading text or a loading spinner. You learned how to handle errors in case something goes wrong. And in general, you hopefully now have an understanding why we might want such a backend, at least for some applications which we're building, and how you can communicate with that backend behind the scenes from inside your Vue app. Using the fetch function, which is built into browsers, is just one way of doing it. I also did mention the Axios package before, which is a third-party package you could add to your project, which also allows you to send such requests. It just works a bit differently. For example, there, catch will automatically also trigger if you get back error responses, so that extra handling we needed with the fetch function would not be required with Axios. But that's it. We're going to see this in action in a course project as well, but this hopefully gets you started and now gives you everything you need for you to start sending HTTP requests in your applications.